The dark psychology was not a shout. It was a slow erasure. She discovered, in the way a bruise learns to bloom, that her mind could quietly kill what she loved. She had been an amateur painter once, fingers stained with cobalt and cadmium. A small corner of the apartment claimed by canvases that smelled like turpentine in mornings. Painting had been a room of her own, an uncluttered place, where she loved the way light landed on edges and how mistakes could become texture. It was honest work, public in small ways. Markets where colors met coins, a friend praising a brushstroke. The feeling of making something that existed outside herself sat like warmth in her chest. That warmth was the first thing to dim Dot. It did not vanish in a dramatic moment. The mind that kills slowly used tactics that felt like kindness. At first she told herself she was simply tired. Her days were crowded with small demands, a job that required her to be amiable. A long commute filled with other people's problems, the subtle labor of being expected to cheer when others needed cheer. Those demands drained her, she reasoned, and art would resume when she had energy. The explanation felt reasonable, and reason had always been a refuge in which she could hide difficult truths. Reason, however, can be a tool of manipulation when turned inward. She began to rearrange her priorities with the same patient hand she used to arrange brushes. She scheduled shorter painting sessions, then skipped them entirely. Each skipped hour was not tragedy, but a calculation. The dark psychology she now lived by taught her to identify friction and remove it. If making art required a conflicted self, then removing the need to produce felt like efficiency. She called it pragmatism. The word sounded competent. It sounded necessary. People around her had opinions, well-meaning suggestions that became additional weights. "You'll find your way back," they said, their voices like lint that clung to fabric. Those assurances were gentle weapons. They assumed she would return because she had returned from other things before. The assumption wrapped around her like a shawl, comfortable, smothering. She accepted it because acceptance required less effort than resistance. There was also another force at work, more intimate and less named, a slow accretion of doubt. When she looked at a half-finished canvas, she did not see future possibility. She saw the past she had been unable to protect. The paint that once sang now felt like a ledger of time she could not buy back. The mind that used to create began to catalog mistakes like crimes. Each perceived failure hardened into a reason to stop. She told herself the truth was simply a new taste. She liked different things now. If asked, she could imitate conviction. But imitation was not conviction. It was a kind of performance she had learned to do well. The first real alarm came not from the canvas, but from a stranger's compliment. A woman in a gallery asked where she learned to paint. When the question touched her, she felt it dissolving. The details of process were suddenly private in a way that felt defensive. She answered in safe fragments, spoke about inspiration without naming labor, and watched the listener's interest fade into polite applause. The compliment, once a fuel, had become an accusation, proof that she had once loved something she now could not defend. The mind that killed did not need malice. It needed only a narrative that reframed love as liability. She started to experiment with displacement. Painting hours became errands. Mornings once devoted to color, now filled with tasks that left the day exhausted but explainable. Houseplants needed watering. Emails required thoughtful replies. A neighbor's life grew more pressing than her own. Tasks have the advantage of being socially legible. Everyone understands the logic of doing chores. Passion, in contrast, asks for time with no visible return. The world rewards the legible. The mind that quietly killed learned to prefer reward. One night, with rain drumming a minor percussion against the window, she stood in front of the largest canvas she owned. The image on it was a fragment, warm light on a chair, a shadow where a person might sit. She touched the dried paint, feeling the ridge of an earlier decision. Shame arrived like a cold hand. She realized the theft had not been external. It had been an interior decision, a series of small withdrawals she had authorized because each felt small enough to be forgiven. When losses are fractioned, grief loses its shape. It becomes a vague fatigue that people offer tea to and then forget. She considered the possibility of manipulation in a different sense. Could she be manipulating herself? The question felt like looking into a mirror and finding a stranger. She had read about emotional control and how people engineer dependency. The terms dark psychology, manipulative tactics, evil mind sounded dramatic when applied to strangers in articles. It was harder to hear them as a description of the architecture inside her head. Yet there it was, a pattern. She had reallocated attention from what fed her soul to what preserved her comfort. Comfort, she learned, is a sly kind of prison. It shields from immediate pain while eroding future desires. The mind prefers predictability. It will trade passion for the safe hum of routine given a chance. She watched the pattern form and felt less like a victim and more like an engineer of extinction. There was a precision to it, a careful balancing of obligations and self-exemptions that kept her functioning while starving her loves. The methodology had an input and output, fewer brushes in hand, more answers given, less room for resistance. The last admission in that room was quiet. She did not announce a decision. Instead, she turned off the studio light, closed the door, and walked away. The darkness was not theatrical. It was final in a small way. The mind had not required drama. It had required surrender. She slept with the knowledge that something talented had softened inside her. The thought did not produce panic. Panic would have been an acknowledgement and possibly a catalyst. Instead, she felt a slow, almost academic sadness. She cataloged each reason for retreat and found them all plausible. The journal entries that once documented experiments in color lay empty. In their place were lists of sensible alternatives, tasks she could justify. The dark psychology of self-extinguishment had a vocabulary, and she was fluent. She began to trace the choices like maps. Mapping felt safe. It transformed choices into charts that could be navigated. The maps were detailed. Times she had chosen convenience. Conversations she had avoided. Moments when she had reframed desire as impractical. She labeled places on the map with neutral words. Busy, priority, season, and that neutrality hid a more troubling calculus. A pattern of emotional control aimed inward. There were reasons, and she cataloged them all with the efficiency of someone who once cataloged pigments. Her childhood had taught barter. Affection arrived only after performance in the house where she grew up. Warm words were currency, and only occasionally given. She had learned to perform to be loved, to withhold need to preserve stability. Those early trades had been survival mechanisms. As an adult, they smoothed into strategy. Survival logic, unexamined, becomes blueprint. That revelation carried raw edges. It explained why giving up felt like safety rather than loss. She tested hypotheses. If the mind preferred predictable reward, could she rebalance it by creating new habits that forced attention back to what she loved? She scheduled an hour of painting on Tuesday mornings and barred herself from excuses. The first session felt clumsy, like a body relearning motion. She painted a bowl of pears with awkward confidence. The pears did not judge. They sat in a small, patient stillness. She felt small triumphs. A color mixed cleanly, a shadow that imagined depth. For a few hours, the map showed a route she could travel, but old patterns resist like gravity. The next day, a call arrived asking for help with a colleague's crisis. She rationalized. 1 hour would save someone stress. It was compassionate to respond. Compassion, when it becomes habitual at the cost of self, can be a means of erasure. She accepted the request and did not paint. Each compromise was a tiny lesson reconfirming the safety of surrender. It was easier to be needed than to be visible in her own making. There was a man in her life now, not romantic in any large way, but present, who noticed the gaps. He observed her with a quiet insistence that felt like another mirror. He asked why she painted less, not in accusation, but in curiosity. Questioning can be a mercy. When someone notices the erosion of a person's habits, it becomes harder to pretend everything is fine. His observation cut through the rationalizations. For a moment, she felt exposed. That exposure was frightening because it required naming the thing she had been concealing even from herself. She tried to explain in measured words. She spoke of fatigue and seasons and emotional bandwidth. Those were truths, but partial. A more honest answer would have admitted the sediment, a history of choosing safety, the convenience of being useful to others instead of unapologetically selfish in the service of art. Honesty demands risk. She was, by habit, skilled at minimizing risk. Minimization had saved her before. Now it preserved an empty shelf. The map began to show more than roots. It showed patterns of justification. Whenever she felt a pull back to painting, some practical reason emerged to delay. Rent needed attention. Emails required a reply. Friends needed small emotional labor. Each obligation was legitimate, and legitimacy smoothed conscience. The mind that kills loves legitimate reasons. They act like camouflage. She watched the list form and noticed a new emotional reaction: shame. Shame was a quieter animal than guilt. Guilt looks toward repair. Shame looks inward and says, quietly, "You are the problem." She began to see how manipulation, often described as outward aggression, could be internalized. She had used tactics on others in previous years. Charm, tuning speech to fit listeners, small omissions, tools of influence that felt practical and precise. Now, those same tools were turned inward. She convinced herself to accept less joy in exchange for fewer complications. The technique was familiar, the intention different only in direction. The dark psychology she had studied in articles about evil minds now had a reflection inside her own chest. Trauma, she realized, had shaped the map more than she liked to acknowledge. Small humiliations of youth, the way affection depended on performance, the occasional dismissal by someone who was supposed to notice, those experiences had built an architecture of mistrust. She had come to expect the desire would be punished by disappointment. So she learned to preempt heartbreak by shrinking love before it had a chance to root. The pattern looked, from the outside, cowardly. From the inside, it was a cautious prophylactic. Her experiments continued. She tried forcing accountability with a friend who would check on her painting schedule. External pressure, she thought, could beat the internal scripts. For a while it worked. She painted more during weeks when someone asked about it. The presence of witness brings a strange kind of discipline. But the witness also became a mirror whose reflection she could adjust. She began to perform productivity in front of others, and when the witness looked away, the old script reasserted itself. External accountability can be a band-aid unless the interior script rewrites itself. She noticed, too, the social calculus that conspired against passion. When she spoke about painting in public, people often offered small, patronizing compliments that implied casual hobby rather than vocation. The social language preferred smallness. "Oh, that's so nice." Or "You should do that when you're free." Even kindness can act as erasure if it habitually frames passion as optional. She felt her work infantilized by affection that meant well but did not see the cost. The mind that quietly kills learned to accept those diminutive voices as truth. One night she counted reasons aloud in her head, cataloging them like items on a shelf. The lists multiplied and began to sound plausible. The map had become a justification factory. In the silence that followed, she felt a stirring of anger, not the combustible anger of young rebellion, but a slow, righteous indignation that wanted to be directed outward, to blame systems instead of her choices. Blame is comforting in its absoluteness. It spares the difficult labor of changing the pattern from within. That week she painted a small panel in the early hours before anyone texted. The act felt clandestine and right. Color arrived like a withheld breath. In the painting, she caught something she recognized, the face of the child she had once been, intent and unashamed. The image unsettled her because it made visible what she had been erasing. It also offered a possibility. The map could be rewritten. She tucked the panel away like a secret map fragment, hope and fear coiled together. She thought the test would be external, a loss or a demand that exposed her calculus. Instead, the test arrived as a quiet decision by someone she had come to rely on. The man who had watched her maps for months announced a move far away. He would take a job that was impossibly good, a career pivot that made practical sense. The news landed like a small explosion in the careful plan she had built. He did not ask permission to stay. He simply told her what he would do. The news forced a reckoning. If she had been sculpting her life to avoid vulnerability, the absence of a witness would be a true measure. Would she continue the small betrayals to herself when the person who had been a mirror was gone? The question felt like a final exam. It demanded an answer she could not workshop away with lists. She tried the old strategies. She scheduled painting sessions and then let other obligations encroach. She negotiated with herself using plausible reasons. The mind that kills prefers negotiation because it buys time. Time, in this case, had sharpened into urgency. When the man left, the absence was palpable, not theatrical, but like the removal of a familiar background noise. She had to stand in the new quiet and see what choices she would make without a confirming gaze. The first week after he left, she floundered. The old ledger of excuses reopened like a ledger of debts. She felt the familiar shame and the comfortable pull toward tasks. The apartment filled with practical work that smelled faintly of usefulness. And yet something else happened. She painted one evening because no one asked her not to. The act felt dangerously personal. The brush moved with a deliberateness that was equal parts fear and hunger. For the first time in months, she painted not to prove anything, not for witness, but because the doing itself quieted an ache. Then came a fracture she had not predicted. A friend, scrolling through social media, commented that she seemed different lately. The word landed like an accusation. She felt exposed and defensive. Underneath the defensiveness was a rawness, the awareness that she had been changing, not only her routine but the way she allowed herself to feel. The friend's observation felt like a mirror with a chip. She could either hide behind the old scripts or answer honestly and risk losing more people. She chose an honesty that surprised her. She told the friend simply that she had been stealing her own life and that she wanted it back. The admission did not come as an elegant speech. It came as a tired confession at midnight. The friend listened, not with the patronizing kindness that once comforted her, but with an even attention that asked no immediate repair. That kind of attention was rarer than she expected and more restorative than 100 small favors. The real struggle, however, was not with others. It was the internal architecture of influence she had used to be safe. When she began to prioritize painting, the world pushed back in small, predictable ways. People asked for favors that fit old patterns. Colleagues requested emotional labor. Guilt surfaced as a tactic they did not intend but nonetheless wielded. The mind had been trained to respond to guilt by surrender. She now had to rely on refusal. Refusal felt like a rude muscle. Her first attempts were clumsy. She said no to one favor and noticed a slight recoil on the face of the asker. Shame rose hot and immediate. But the recoil also clarified something. Not all refusals were betrayals. Some were necessary boundaries that allowed her to keep the fragile habit of creating. Gradually, she found that saying no did not always sever connection. Sometimes it preserved it in a truer form. Months later, she stood at a small gallery where two of her newest pieces hung. People she had known for years came, some surprised, some quietly pleased. The man returned for a brief visit and did not speak as if he had been a witness. He greeted her as if she had been present all along. The pieces on the wall were not triumphs of public acclaim. They were small proof that the thing she loved could endure attention. Her mind had not been cured. The old patterns shimmered like thin ice. She still measured the temperature of social exchanges, still felt the ease of slipping into being useful. The dark psychology that once smoothed her away remained available, a tool that could be reprised. But now she had new practices: accountability, refusal, and a habit of showing up in small, testable ways. She had learned that reclamation is incremental. Closure arrived not as redemption, but as a sober acceptance. She could not declare herself wholly reborn. She had not engineered a moral transformation. She had, instead, learned to notice the slow erosions and to interrupt them with action. That interruption, repeated, rewired the pathways that had once preferred safety over love. She walked home alone that night, the city light washing the pavement, and thought of the mind that quietly kills what it loves. It had been merciless and practical, a kind of internal bureaucracy that justified its administrative removals. She felt gratitude toward the person she had been, the one who had learned to survive, and toward the person she was becoming, someone willing to be less efficient if that meant being more alive. If this story made you think, subscribe for more dark truths, because every mind hides what it fears most.